Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, this is Emerson Purbo, and this is Introduction to Literature class, and this is a midterm project, and it is about explaining the material that we are good at. And now I'm going to explain to you guys about the definition of poetry and also the elements of poetry. So I'm going to share screen my PowerPoint first. And here are my PowerPoint. So the title is Definition of Poetry and Its Elements. My WhatsApp group is 23JJITL SN78K7/22, being taught by Miss Leni Marlina. And here is my table of contents or the subtopics that I'm going to discuss this after this meeting. The first one is definition of poetry, and the second one is elements of poetry. Moving on, here is the first subtopic, and it is about definition of poetry. So, what is poetry? From Bernie Olila and Joe Janta's book in 2006, poetry is any kind of verbal or written language that is structured rhythmically and is meant to tell a story or express any kind of emotion, idea, or even state of being. So, from this sentence, we can conclude that poetry has two main forms, and it is verbal, or it could be also a written language. And then the function of the poetry is there are a few functions of poetry. The first one is to tell a story or express any kind of emotion, idea, or even state of being. So I'm going to give you an example. For example, when a poet when a poet feeling sad or even happy or even they are fell in love and they want to express their feeling, they may use a poetry. Or when a poet is wanted to criticize a government, for example, the government is not good at leading their people, and this poet want to criticize the government. They want to explain their state of being, right? And they can do that through a poetry, by the media through the poetry. And then there are certain forms and patterns that poets follow in the composition process of their work. These differences forms were birthed out of separate artistic and cultural movements. So there are many forms and also patterns in poetry that a poet need to follow when they're making a poetry or a poem. And then we're asking, how can this variety or a variation of forms and patterns in poetry birthed out? And there are two main reasons for that. The first one is separate artistic or different views on art. For example, we are taking William Shakespeare's in England and also Khairil Anwar from Indonesia. So for William Shakespeare's, his views on art, his views on poetry is only to express a feeling, to tell a story, or to giving an idea at the moment in William Shakespeare era. Meanwhile, in Khairil Anwar era, he views an art, he views a poetry, he views a literature as a media to explain a state of being the people of Indonesia in the Netherlands government at the moment. So this different view on art can make a variation of forms and also patterns and poetry. And then the second one is cultural movements or a different culture in another country. For example, William Shakespeare again in England. Of course, the culture in England and also in Indonesian, there are many differences, right? These differences in culture can also make the variation of forms and also patterns in poetry. The second one is another definition of poetry. Meanwhile, in Kevin Bennett and Liam Christopher journal in 2011, they view a poetry not as far as before, my explanation before. Poetry can be thought as a verbal also and a written on form that uses a hidden sense of language to convey experience, feeling, or modes of consciousness. The difference between Kevin Bennett and Liam Christopher and the previous one is Kevin Bennett and Liam Christopher said that it is usually using a heightened sense of language to convey experience, feeling, or modes of consciousness to the reader. So they need to use a heightened sense when making a poetry. And then there is no concrete definition for poetry. It means many different things to different people. Well, they're not really sure what is the true definition of poetry, but at the moment when they're writing a definition of poetry, they thought that poetry has also two main forms, verbal and also written, and they need to use a heightened sense of language to what? To convey experience, feeling, and modes of consciousness to the readers. And then from those two definitions, we can conclude that poetry is any kind of verbal and also written language that used to tell a story, expressing emotion, idea, or even state of being, and usually using a heightened sense of language. And that's the definition of poetry. Moving on to the second subtopics, and it is about elements of poetry. So, elements of poetry. The first one is that, I took the material of elements of poetry from e-learning and also from Liam Christopher and Kevin Bennett in the previous one. So they also mentioned about elements of poetry, and I took a few words from them to explaining to you guys about the elements of poetry. The first one is denotative meaning. Denotative meaning is prescribed by dictionary and encyclopedia. And then the second one is connotative meaning, which arises from context provided by the poem. In e-learning, we are given the poetry about Negro by Miss Leni Marlina. So Negro, the denotative meaning of Negro is a black people, right? But in the connotative meaning, or a meaning that arises from the context provided by the poem in the e-learning, Negro is basically a slave, because the context of the poetry that been given to us in the e-learning is about a slavery, and Negro is a slave. In the context, Negro is a slave, not a black people, like a denotative meaning. So that's the difference between denotative meaning and also connotative meaning. And also, the third one is metaphor. So from Liam Christopher and Kevin Bennett, they said that metaphor is almost similar to simile, but the difference is simile is comparing one thing to other thing. Meanwhile, in metaphor, they are thought that this one thing is actually the other thing. They're also comparing, but they thought that this thing is actually actually the other thing. So when one thing or idea being referred by a word to denoting another thing. So for example, metaphor first, right? Vishnu is such a girl when he screams. And then in the simile, Vishnu screams like a girl. I need to translate this, explain first into Indonesians to make it easier for you guys to understand. Vishnu is such a girl when he screams. Vishnu itu seperti wanita ketika dia berteriak. And in simile, Vishnu screams like a girl. Vishnu ketika berteriak itu seperti wanita. That's the difference between metaphor and simile. In metaphor, they said that Vishnu is really a woman when he's screaming. Meanwhile, in simile, they are comparing that Vishnu's screaming is as similar as the woman as a woman screaming. So to make it easier for you guys to understand, so simile is usually using such as and also like in the sentence. For example, just like I mentioned, Vishnu scream like a girl. Vishnu scream like a woman. Vishnu as stubborn as a rock. Vishnu sama keras kepalanya seperti batu. Meanwhile, in metaphor, they thought that this one thing is actually the other thing. Vishnu is such a girl. Vishnu is such a woman when he is screaming. So that's the difference between metaphor and simile in the Liam Christopher and Kevin Bennett explanation. And then the rest, and then here are the elements of poetry again. Number 4 is personification, in which a thing, animal, or abstract term is made human. Abstract term is such as nature and etc. So I have read about a poetry, and it is about a sun and also a tree. So in this poetry, sun and tree is personificate a god and also a human. Why? Because plant need sun to grow, right? Just like human need God to grow in life. So in that poetry, God being personified as a sun, and then human being personified as a tree. That's kind of personification. That's an example of the personification. And the number 5 is hyperbole, an obvious exaggeration for emphasis in order to create other specific effect. Um, to make it easier for you guys to understand, I always think that hyperbole meaning is melebay-lebaykan in Indonesian. For example, my life filled with rainbow since I have met you, for example. So there's no possible way, right, that our life, that human life being filled with a rainbow, that's meaning melebay-lebaykan, because the point of my sentence is that I am truly in love, but I want to make it hyperbole by saying that my life filled maybe with joy, maybe with rainbow and etc. So that's an example of hyperbole. And the number 6 is metonymy. It is a name of thing is substituted for that of another closely associated with it. For example, again, in Indonesian, we are not used to ask our friend just like this. Hey, can you buy me some bottle of water? No, right? We usually say that. Hey, can you buy me some aqua? Hey, can you Hey, can you buy me some aqua? So this aqua is a substituted name of a bottle of water. That's for example, we're not saying toothpaste. We usually saying Pepsodent, right? And that's kind of an example of metonymy. And the number 7 is synecdoche. They use part of thing to stand for the whole of it or versa. They use part of thing to stand for the whole. So for example, I'm saying this to my friend. Hey, look at my new wheel. I'm saying wheel. I'm not mentioning my friend to see only my wheel. This wheel is part of my car or maybe my motorcycle. This wheel is part of my transportation. This wheel is part of thing to stand for the whole. What is the whole? My transportation. It could be a car, it could be a motorcycle. Okay. So I said that, hey, look at my new wheel. The point of my sentence there is to, hey, look at my transportation. Hey, look at my car. So that they use a part of thing, they use part of car, and it is wheel to stand for the whole, to stand for the car itself. So that's the example of synecdoche. And then this is the rest of the elements of poetry. Number 8 is imagery. Word is not the important aspect, but to make reader hear, feel, or smell the poetry. So the point of imagery is to make the reader can imagine the poetry that we make, whether it is hearing or even feeling or even smelling the poetry. And then the number 9 is haiku, a 3-line Japanese poem with 17 syllables and relies heavily on imagery. So if you would like to, learn more about imagery, you may learn it through haiku, because haiku relies heavily on imagery itself. And then the number 10 is form. Form is the easiest element to find, but poetry doesn't always use a form. Why? Because we already learned in literary convention and innovation. In literary innovation, we may not use stanza or line or rhythm, and that's okay in poetry. But they usually, but for a beginner poet, they usually use a form of poetry, and there are many forms of poetry, right? And it is already being explained by group 5, if I'm not mistaken, 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I think that's all. And yes, thank you everyone for tuning into my presentation. I'm sorry if there are many mistaken things that I'm saying when I'm explaining my mattery. I hope you guys got something from my presentation here. Thank you also for Miss Lenny Marlina for giving us this midterm project. That's all. Have a nice day, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.